already have my order. I was gonna do it in like.
Oh, thanks.
I fear that if it's really tough, I'd be the first one to not. The first was kind of peaceful. I don't know.
All right. Let's get going here. Lesson 17, the Civil Rights Movement. This is an image of Dr. King at the 1963 March on Washington. We'll get into this in the next part of the lesson. Today we're going to get up to 1961. So let's start with the post-World War II era, desegregation of the military and public schools. So in July of 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, which states, "It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." This is a huge step in this modern civil rights movement. Remember, there have been numerous voices during World War II pushing for desegregation, but Roosevelt did not move forward with it. After World War II, Truman will take a step in the right direction here. And once we get into the Korean War and the Vietnam War, those units will be desegregated. This policy was hotly debated and protested, even debated and protested among members of Congress. That is why Truman used an executive order to desegregate the military. The next major step, on May 17th, 1954, the Supreme Court will rule on the landmark Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. This is a unanimous decision to desegregate all public schools in the U.S. and to reverse or repeal Plessy. Okay, so Plessy's done. Brown v. Board overturns it. Okay, bless you. The Chief Justice that leads the court was an Eisenhower appointee, Judge Earl Warren, who had previously been governor of California. A little bit about the Brown case. Linda Brown, elementary age student in Topeka, Kansas, lived in a neighborhood where there was a perfectly good school for her to attend in walking distance of her house. However, due to Jim Crow, she was required to go to a school farther away from her house. Hey, let's go. Thanks. All right. There you go. No problem. This will pave the way for larger scale desegregation. But I do want you all to keep in mind that most of our large scale desegregation does not become official until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson, which will address that in the next part of the lesson. When we get in deeper into the 60s next class. So as I said before, the decision overturns Plessy. Separate but equal segregation of races in public places and educational facilities is now illegal. The NAACP defense attorney in the Brown case was Thurgood Marshall. He was a Howard Law grad who graduated top of his class. He, after all this is said and done, he continues to be a crusader for the Civil Rights era. He will go on to become the first African American to sit on the Supreme Court, nominated by Lyndon B. Johnson. I do want you all to realize that there are 4 additional cases tied to the Brown case. And one of those cases tied to the Brown case is Dorothy Davis versus County School Board of Prince Edward County. Dorothy Davis and the kids at Armoton High School down in Farmville, Virginia, are going to go on strike. Their classrooms were dilapidated. They were having to, basically attend school in these rooms that were just tar papered. They weren't even finished classrooms. Their gymnasium and auditorium was not too much bigger than the room we're in right now. Everything, their books, their music instruments, all that stuff had been handed down the street, or at least on the other side of town in Farmville. A brand new school had been built that they were barred to attend. So they go on strike and take this to the Supreme Court. Their legal defense team is going to be headed up by Oliver Hill. Oliver Hill, also Howard grad, Howard Law. He actually graduated second in his class, just behind Thurgood Marshall. Oliver Hill, with ties to Roanoke, Virginia, and Richmond, he practices law in Richmond, is going to head their NAACP legal defense team. How does the South and other parts of the country respond to Brown v. Board and Davis v. Board? A variety of ways. Massive resistance, trying to block or bar or create local and state laws to prevent African Americans from attending school. School closings, for example, Prince Edward County, in response to the Davis case, they closed their public schools down for 5 years. So not only were African Americans barred from attending school, but all children in Prince Edward County were barred from attending public school. We see the establishment of private academies, not necessarily like the older private academies in Virginia, like the St. Christopher's or like the St. Catherine's, but have you all ever heard of Southampton Academy before? Anybody ever heard of the school? That was an academy established in Southampton County to try to circumvent Brown v. Board. White flight from urban schools. There are two southern cities that have become central case studies for white flight, and those two cities are Richmond and Atlanta. Because what we see happen is these suburbs pop up around these cities in the post-World War II era, and there was segregation in Atlanta and Richmond City, and then when Brown v. Board is passed and desegregation happens, we start to see large waves of communities on the outskirts of cities start to grow, and that leads to white flight. Protests, riots, lynchings, and violence as a result of this. And I don't want you to think that this is just happening at the primary and secondary level. This is also happening on college campuses as well. We'll deal more with that next class. Any questions up to this point? All right. So on the left, this is the legal defense team, the NAACP legal defense team after the Brown decision. There's Thurgood Marshall in the middle here. They're on the steps of the Supreme Court. And on the right, that's Dorothy Davis right there. And those are the kids from Armoton High School. And you can see that's what their classrooms look like in the background there. The now since in Farmville created a museum to honor these kids and their sacrifice in the civil rights movement. Has anyone ever been to the Mountain Museum? Okay. How many of you guys have ever gone to the Virginia State Capitol before? Okay. There's now a monument at the Virginia State Capitol honoring the Mountain kids and the NAACP defense team. All right. The murder of Emmett Till. I don't know if you've heard of this kid before, but remember when we had the Great Migration occur in the early 1900s during the Harlem Renaissance, and then during and after World War I, and then during and after World War II, we need to remember that just because African American families leave the American South and go north to escape Jim Crow and to find job opportunities, that doesn't mean all of their family leaves the South, right? So often in the summers, what you'll see happen, and I mean, how many of you guys out there go visit family somewhere else in the summers? I did that as a kid. My kids go back to my hometown in the summer to spend time with family, all right? Well, that was going on at this period of time. So, and until he lived in Chicago, his mother sent him down to spend time with family. And in August of 1955, he was kidnapped, brutally beaten, shot, and dumped in the Tallahatchie River for allegedly whistling at a white woman and making a comment to her, which was never truly confirmed. It was all just hearsay. The two men responsible, Roy Bryant, the woman's husband, and J.W. Millam, his half-brother, they're arrested for murder, but they were acquitted by an all-white jury. Years later, the two boasted about committing the murder in an interview with Look magazine and were still never brought to justice. To try to provide for her own justice and the justice of her child, this made national and international news, and all types of news outlets attended Emmett Till's funeral. She not forced, but she made a point to have an open casket funeral so the entire world could see what had happened to her son. It's a pivotal moment in the modern civil rights movement. It motivates a lot of people who were kind of leery about getting involved. They start to really get involved after the death of Emmett Till. Unbelievably, remember we learned about Ida B. Wells, crusader for anti-lynching legislation in the early 1900s? Well, it won't be until 2022, during the Biden administration, that the U.S. anti-lynching law is passed by Congress and signed by President Biden, and the law is named in Emmett Till's honor. Any questions about Emmett Till? All right. The NAACP. I feel that it's important to revisit this organization. We learned about them in the Progressive era, founded by W.B. Du Bois. Ida B. Wells was an early female leader of the organization. Their goal was to challenge Jim Crow, segregation, and other violations of the 14th Amendment, among others, in the courts. But I want you guys to realize that this organization becomes way more robust after World War I and World War II because more African Americans have access to higher education, but notably, law programs improve over time. And really sort of like the crown jewel law program for African Americans in this era was Howard. And Howard is still an amazing college and an amazing law school. But at this point, very few African Americans had access to the law programs that typically come to our mind, right? Harvard, Yale, Princeton, UVA, William & Mary, Georgetown, Stanford. That takes time. Well, as more African Americans attend law school, practice law, teach law, the NAACP defense teams become much more skilled and much more highly educated. So this organization still exists to this day. to fight for civil rights. So I just felt like we needed to kind of come back to them. And a big part of their crusade then, as it is now, is to ensure that voting rights are not violated. So we're going to talk more about the NAACP for the remainder of the lesson today in the next class. So Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, excellent job out there. We brought that up earlier. I do want you all to know that this was not by accident. Rosa Parks was very, very smart, insanely talented. She served as secretary for her NAACP local chapter in Montgomery. She grew up in a very rural area of Alabama, but managed to receive a pretty solid education for the situation she was in. She is one of the few women in the state, one of the few African American women in the state of Alabama that had the right to vote, which means she's had to have done what? Pass the literacy test. And what is she paid? Specifically, what is that tax called? It's called a poll tax. So she has passed the literacy test. She's paid the poll tax. Dr. King is instrumental in this process. At this period of time, he's involved in the Montgomery Improvement Association to convince her to launch this nonviolent protest. So, on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat at the front of a bus to a white passenger, defying the Jim Crow transportation law. Sounds familiar, right? That was Plessy v. Ferguson on the train car all the way back in the late 1890s. She was arrested for refusing to move, and due to her arrest, conviction, and fine, the African American community of Montgomery goes on strike and boycotts the buses. They are their largest clientele. The African American community used the buses for transportation to work, so they go on strike, and the bus company nearly goes bankrupt. A little over a year later, December 21st, 1956, Montgomery will desegregate the buses. This is a watershed moment in the civil rights movement because other people are going to start carrying out nonviolent protest, like Rosa Parks. But a lot of it will be met with violence. So we just discussed Dr. King's involvement in Montgomery. In 1957, Dr. King, Charlie Steele, and Fred Shuttlesworth established the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, of which King was made the first president. This is a really robust group. In fact, this group is going to lead to splinter organizations, which I'll talk about as we move forward today. So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference became a major force in organizing the modern civil rights movement based on the principles of nonviolence and civil disobedience. According to King, it was essential that the civil rights movement not sink to the level of the racists and hate mongers who oppose them. A direct quote from King: "We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline." Does everybody agree with him, though? No. Okay, just like we learned about all the way back in the abolitionist movement, right? Not everybody sees eye to eye on this. There will be other parts of the movement that are not in line with Dr. King, especially after so much of these nonviolent protests of the 50s and the early 60s are met with horrible violence, and a lot of that violence carried out by chapters of the Ku Klux Klan in the Deep South. This is another watershed moment. Any questions about the SCLC? They're going to be a big part of the March on Washington in '63. All right, the Little Rock Nine. These kids make a huge, huge impact, not only in the South, but nationwide, because others are going to follow their lead. At the start of the school year of 1957, Little Rock, Arkansas was the center stage for massive resistance in the U.S. in response to the Brown decision. The formerly all-white Central High School learned that the school would be integrated in September of 1957. That's 3 years after Brown. So again, the localities in the states are slowly trying to drag this thing out, not following through with federal law here. 9 African American students, technically 10 students, because this is a really sad situation. One of the students, they were all going to school together, like as a unified force, but one of the students didn't get there in time, and she had to enter the school by herself, and she managed to, she was horribly harassed, but after it was all said and done, she actually left the school and went back to her home school. This is massive resistance. In response to these kids attending Central High School, Arkansas National Guard, by order of the Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus, are brought in to prevent these kids from entering the school. Well, now the president has to act. Eisenhower forces them to allow the kids to attend school by sending in federal soldiers. The 101st Airborne guys, the guys that dropped into D-Day at Normandy, they have to escort these kids to school and to class every day for an entire year. The first kid to graduate is Ernest Green. I had the opportunity to meet him. Amazing man. And we asked him, what made you do it? And he said, honestly, I was very interested in being part of the civil rights movement, but also, he's like, it just kind of came down to me personally. The best teachers and the best education was in that high school, and I believe that I deserved it. I think that's powerful. If you ever get a chance to check out any of their interviews, pretty amazing. Also, there's a really great segment in the series Eyes on the Prize, based on the Little Rock Nine, that you guys should check out. So, for a year, these kids get escorted to school. And in the end, one additional kid will withdraw, but in the end, 8 of the 10 original end up graduating. Ernest Green being the first. But this is insanity, right? The fact that these kids have to be militarily escorted by soldiers just to be able to receive an education. Any questions about the Little Rock Nine? All right, so Rosa Parks, the Little Rock Nine, among other events that don't get as much press, are going to inspire the sit-ins. Somebody brought up sit-ins earlier? Awesome. Can't remember who did. But the sit-ins, the first major sit-in that received national recognition was on February 1st, 1960, when 4 African-American students from North Carolina A&T, Agriculture and Technical, HBCU, down in Greensboro, are going to go in and sit at the Woolworths lunch counter. This is kind of a hard thing for us to wrap our heads around, because you guys probably go to Target, right? Maybe shop, and you might be able to like pick up a bag of popcorn or like a Starbucks coffee. But imagine everybody in here's been to River City Diner at some point, right? Yeah. Imagine walking into River City Diner, right? And you know the right-hand side where they've got the booths and the bar. Take that whole section of River City Diner and put it in Target. That's what lunch counter was. It's kind of, how many of you all have ever eaten at the Midlothian Apothecary before? That's a lunch counter. That's what that is. All right? Or Westbury Pharmacy in the West End. That's a lunch counter. So these kids, they were horribly harassed. They weren't served. They just sat there. They couldn't be removed for sitting there, but they weren't served. And it is going to inspire other groups of some high school kids, but also, like for the most part, college students to get involved and to carry out sit-ins. Here in Richmond, there's a really famous sit-in at Tallheimer's. Are y'all familiar with Tallheimer's? It's like a department store in Richmond. It was like a huge deal. I would compare it to like Macy's. Lunch counter at Tallheimer's was segregated. Students from Virginia Union go in and have a nonviolent sit-in. And this really starts to become a trend. They actually had a really cool benefit a few years back to recognize the Tallheimer sit-in in Richmond, and John Legend performed. It was pretty amazing. So sit-ins start happening everywhere. Integration of parks, swimming pools, theaters, libraries, public facilities. And this is a very instrumental moment for young activists. So, young activism. There is a very important woman who's part of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference named Ella Baker. And she realizes that these young people, they need to be trained and be organized. So at Shaw University, have you ever heard of Shaw down in Raleigh? It's an HBCU. At Shaw, Ella Baker is going to establish what is called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. The goal of this is to get both white and African American students together to perform nonviolent sit-ins, and these trainings are going to take place at colleges all across the country, but most especially at HBCUs, predominantly in the American South. Has anyone ever heard of the film The Butler before? Ever heard of it? Civil rights film. There's a portion of that where the kids at Fisk, are y'all familiar with Fisk? That's where W.B. Du Bois got his undergrad. They have like Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee training in that part of the film. Whatever, doesn't matter. So this is going to get numerous young people involved, but over time, the group becomes a little bit more radical because how are they being met? With what? When these kids go into these nonviolent scenarios, how are they being treated? With what? Violence, right? And that's where they start to decide to become a bit more radical. And the guy that makes them a bit more radical or pushes them that direction is this guy over here, Stokely Carmichael. He's the fourth chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee from 1966 to 1967. Howard graduate, brilliant, philosophy major, got a full scholarship to go get a master's and PhD from Harvard, turned it down to be part of the movement, all right? But because they weren't all on the same page in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he leaves that organization in 1967 to become the Prime Minister of the Black Panther Party in 67. Carmichael, key leader of the Black Power movement. After his role in the Panthers, he ends up going abroad, sending his message beyond American borders, and will go on to change his name to Kwame Ture in 1969 in Guinea, West Africa. He dies in the late 90s of cancer, but he's instrumental in this movement and the era. The next guy that takes over SNCC is H. Rap Brown. He takes over in 67, and this is when white members are pushed out of SNCC, which creates controversy among the founders because the goal was to try to create unity among young people. All right, this is where we wrap up today. 1961 Freedom Rides. There were quite a few kids that were involved in two organizations on this journey. Kids that were members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and kids that were members of CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. So over the spring and summer of 1961, student volunteers and adults, there are even college professors that jumped in there, are going to board buses in DC, and they are going to make their way south. One of the first stops was in Richmond. When they got to Richmond, nobody really knew what to do, and I met one of the organizers years ago of the Freedom Rides, Y.T. Walker, really great guy. And I was like, not just me, but my students that I had with me at this event, they were like, what happened when you got to Richmond? Were you like stopped? Were you harassed? And he's like, no, actually Richmond, everybody was just kind of shocked. They didn't know what we were actually doing, but people warned us that it was just going to get worse the farther we got south. It starts to get violent for them when they get to South Carolina, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. When they get to Anniston, Alabama, one of their buses is firebound. People are attacked and beaten along the way. John Lewis was attacked in the Freedom Rides. But by the time it comes to an end and they get to Jackson, Mississippi, the kids that have stuck it out, they're arrested. Now, a lot of them end up having their bail posted, and they wind up going south to New Orleans. Have you guys ever heard of Sammy Davis Jr. before? Part of the Rat Pack, performed with Frank Sinatra? Any? Never? He actually posted bail for some of these kids, but some of them refused their bail to be posted. Why would these kids be like, nope, I don't want to get out of jail? Any ideas? What's that? Well, that's a really good point. They wanted to inconvenience the state of Mississippi and the city of Jackson. They're like, yeah, we're going to stay in here and we're going to let you figure this out, because are they violating any laws? No. Actually, the Interstate Commerce Commission, there was a law passed that had desegregated public transportation. So by this kid staying in jail, like the Kennedy administration is like on the phone. John F. Kennedy's brother, Bobby, who was Attorney General, is on the phone with the ICC and is like, you guys better get up with Congress and tighten this law up, because we cannot have this happen. So it's a really powerful moment in the movement. But it's also one where you start to see a splintering occur, because not all of these nonviolent protesters want to stay nonviolent any longer. Dr. King was elated by what they had done, but there were numerous people, African American and white, who were hospitalized from these attacks. And some of the people narrowly got off this bus in Anniston that was firebombed by a chapter of the KKK in Alabama. Questions, comments, concerns? All right, that's where we're going to pump the brakes. We will get into the 60s, pick up with 62 when I see you guys next class.